It's 6 p.m. on a Tuesday here in Korea. Welcome to our newscast. I'm Daniel Che. Let's begin with the headlines. With less than 2 months to go until the next general election, South Korean lawmakers finally reach a long-awaited compromise on redrawing the country's electoral map. Seoul and Washington have postponed formal talks on the deployment of a U.S. missile defense system to Korea. This comes as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry prepares to meet his Chinese counterpart in Washington later this week, with a UN resolution on North Korea's latest provocations expected to top the agenda. The nation's export volume index has plunged to a 7-year low, mainly due to a decline in outbound shipment of electronics goods and machinery. Let's start things off at the domestic political arena. The National Assembly Speaker had announced that he would use the power of his position to introduce a contentious counterterrorism bill for a full floor vote scheduled for this afternoon. But it seems the parliamentary session hasn't even started yet. For the latest, let's turn to our Shin Se-min, who is standing by at the National Assembly. Se-min, what exactly is going on over there?
Good evening, Daniel. It seemed like the rival political parties were on the same page this morning when they agreed to redraw the country's electoral map, but it looks like things are back to square one as they're at a standstill again. Now, the regular session initially scheduled to take place at 2 p.m. this afternoon has been postponed for a little over 4 hours as we speak. As a number of lawmakers required for a quorum has not been met, with the majority of lawmakers from the main opposition Minju Party of Korea failing to appear. Now, the party's absence appears to be an expression of its displeasure with Assembly Speaker Chung Il-hwa's announcement that he would use his power to introduce a controversial counterterrorism bill. Now, the opposition party has also submitted a motion for a filibuster to the Assembly Speaker later in the afternoon to stall the legislative proceedings. The ruling Saenuri Party, on the other hand, tried to find a way to speed things up by assembling a commission on the counterterrorism bill and an act on cyberterrorism prevention, but that appears to have been put on hold with the filibuster in motion.
Right, I mean, the counterterrorism bill has also been the main obstacle for progress on the electoral map issue as well, right?
That's right. It's been months in the process as the rival political parties were able to come up with the country's electoral map. Now, just 50 days before the April 13th general elections, the rival political parties were able to draw up the electoral map from a meeting this morning with the leaders of the two main rival parties and the Assembly Speaker Chung Il-hwa. Now, here's what they agreed on. They will keep the number of assembly seats to 300, but have decided to allocate 253 seats to district representatives, up from the current 246. Now, they have also designated 47 seats to proportional representatives. Now, the map, which expired at the end of last year, was redrawn to reflect changes in the population in recent years. Based on that, as you can see, the areas in blue, Gyeonggi-do and Chungcheongnam-do provinces, and major cities like Incheon and Daejeon and the capital of Seoul have gotten bigger, while the areas in orange, Gangwon-do, Jeollabuk-do, Jeollanam-do, and Gyeongsangbuk-do provinces got smaller. Now, the next step is the plan will go through a final review by the National Election Commission and is expected to be put to a vote by the full assembly on Friday. But with the parliament deadlocked again, it is unclear whether the vote will go ahead as planned. That's all from me for now. This is Shin Se-min reporting live from the National Assembly.
All right, thank you for that, Se-min. Moving on to other stories, South Korea and the U.S. were set to sign an agreement early Tuesdays to start talks on the potential deployment of a THAAD battery on the Korean peninsula. But the highly anticipated event was abruptly delayed. Seoul said that a little more time was needed to make some final adjustments. Connie Kim brings us the latest.
South Korea and the U.S. have abruptly delayed signing an agreement on setting up a joint working group that'll discuss the deployment of an American terminal high-altitude area defense system to South Korea. Seoul announced a postponement Tuesday, shortly before the accord was scheduled to be signed. This setback is gaining attention as it coincides with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's meeting with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry in Washington. China has long been against the deployment of a THAAD system in South Korea, given that the radar system can cover half of its mainland area.
The postponement is seen as an act to refrain from provoking China ahead of a meeting to adjust the level of sanctions on North Korea from the UN Security Council.
China's strong opposition was echoed by its ambassador to South Korea. Chu Go-hong warned the deployment could destroy Seoul-Beijing ties, adding that Seoul should thoroughly consider whether its security will be guaranteed. Seoul and Washington have maintained that the U.S.-made missile defense system will only be used against North Korean missiles. Deterring against the North's threats has risen as a focus between the two allies in the wake of Pyongyang's latest nuclear and long-range missile tests. Seoul and Washington are set to discuss details about cost-sharing and location of a THAAD system deployment when talks get underway, but experts say China may be holding up the process. Many are watching to see whether a compromise can be reached with Beijing in bringing the U.S.-made anti-ballistic missile system to South Korea. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Seoul's foreign ministry says the country will not build its own nuclear arsenal, adding it stands firm in its commitment to nonproliferation. This comes in response to expert opinions saying that nuclear armament is an effective deterrent against the threats from North Korea. Kim Min-ji brings us this report.
South Korea is firmly committed to nuclear non-proliferation. That's according to Seoul's foreign ministry, which on Tuesday dismissed calls for the country to build its own nuclear arsenal to counter North Korea's nuclear and missile threats.
You could say the call for nuclear armament comes from experts' frustrations with how to deter North Korea, which has conducted 4 nuclear tests and its recent long-range missile launch. Our government is actively contributing to global nuclear non-proliferation and working to strengthen it.
The spokesperson went on to say that South Korea is covered under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and in a crisis, the two sides will step up their defense readiness. In regards to reports that the U.S. and North Korea exchanged views last year over Pyongyang's proposal to start peace treaty talks, the spokesperson said it could be discussed so long as the North makes progress towards denuclearization. Meanwhile, Seoul's defense minister says North Korea might be preparing to launch a larger long-range missile. During a meeting of the Parliamentary Defense Committee, Defense Minister Han Min-gu said there is a possibility that Pyongyang could conduct a launch in order to achieve its military goals. Han noted that last year the North raised the height of a launch pad at its Dongchangli rocket launch facility, located off its west coast, from 50 meters to 67. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Thursday will mark the start of President Park Geun-hye's 4th year in office, so we are taking a look back at her successes and failures over the past 12 months and also ahead at what might be in store going forward with a special series of reports. Kwon So-wha brings us the second installment focusing on diplomatic efforts.
Some 30 overseas trips in 3 years, more than any other South Korean president in history. Efforts to bolster Korea's relations with its foreign partners, building international consensus on reunification of the two Koreas, and cooperation on denuclearizing the North have been key goals on the Park administration's diplomatic front. The terms summit diplomacy, sales diplomacy, and unification diplomacy have been omnipresent during President Park's 3 years in office. This concentration on diplomatic performance reinforced relationships with the U.S., assessed as being at an all-time high, as well as with China, particularly on business matters, with the effectuation of the Seoul-Beijing Free Trade Agreement.
She seems to have a pretty good relationship with Barack Obama. But other than that, I would have to just say that the relationship with China is the biggest one, which is appropriate because China is becoming more and more important to the South Korean economy and South Korean politics in general. China is often pointed to as the country that has the most influence over North Korea.
But in the wake of North Korea's recent nuclear and long-range missile tests, experts have noted the lack of cooperation from China in global efforts led by President Park to punish Pyongyang for its continuous violations of UN resolutions.
I think now she's moving towards some different trajectory of her policies so that the resultant objective of her policy would be more pragmatic rather than something based upon a trust or some higher expectations on other neighboring superpowers. Some recommendations I have is, why don't we have South Korea, North Korea, U.S. trilateral dialogue?
While North Korea remains under the international spotlight, follow-up measures to the so-called comfort women issue, including Japan's denying of the existence of records on the military's forced recruitment of wartime sex slaves, and ongoing talks between Seoul and Beijing on a maritime demarcation line, are other challenges that must be addressed during the remainder of President Park Geun-hye's term in office. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
The index gauging Korea's export volume has dropped by the biggest margin since 2009. That's when the country was still reeling from the global financial crisis. The Bank of Korea says the country's export volume index plunged by around 7.5% last month from the same month a year ago. The central bank attributes the drop to a decline in outbound shipments in electronics, goods, and machinery. The index for import volume was down nearly 6%, also marking the biggest decrease since 2009. But Korea's terms of trade improved in January from a year earlier, as import prices fell faster by 16% than export prices, which dropped by around 11%. A new report from the OECD attempts to measure quality jobs in a country, and Korea is not doing so well. The average hourly wage workers received here remained rooted in the lower rank among the 33 member nations surveyed. Hwang Jie shares with us the results.
Roughly $14.5 US. That's how much the average Korean worker earns in an hour, which is only about half of what workers in Germany make. According to a job quality report by the OECD, Korea's purchasing power parity adjusted gross hourly earnings ranked 22nd, remaining in the lower tier among the 33 member countries. Topping the list were European countries like Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, while Mexico sat at the bottom. The OECD's measure gauges how employment contributes to material living conditions, or in other words, workers' well-being, and how the earnings are distributed across the workforce. And experts attribute Korea's rather disappointing scorecard to long working hours coupled with low productivity. The OECD says Korean employees worked for around 2,100 hours on average in 2014, the world's second longest after Mexico, and well over the 1,300 hours German people spent at work that year. Experts add it's inevitable longer working hours will result in slipping productivity. They say local companies should stop insisting on their employees working extreme amounts of overtime. Hwang Jie, Arirang News.
Overseas card spending by Koreans surged to an all-time high in 2015, with more people traveling abroad. According to the Bank of Korea, card transactions abroad totaled $13.26 billion last year, up 8.7% from the previous year. This includes purchases made by debit and direct payment cards. The latest figure marks the slowest rate of on-year growth since the year 2012. The number of cards issued for overseas use jumped nearly 27% on-year, which shows Korean travelers simply cut down on their spending. Credit card spending by foreign visitors in Korea plunged over 13% on-year to just over $10 billion last year due to the outbreak of the Middle East respiratory syndrome in May. Fears of a British exit from the European Union have pushed the pound to a 7-year low. With exactly 4 months to go until the British public votes on whether to stay in or leave the EU, Prime Minister David Cameron clashed with the London mayor in what's likely a sign of the heated debates to come. Kwon Jang-ho tells us more.
British Prime Minister David Cameron and London Mayor Boris Johnson went head-to-head in the House of Commons on Monday.
Can I ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, to explain to the House and to the country in exactly what way this deal returns sovereignty over any field of lawmaking to these Houses of Parliament?
This deal brings back some welfare powers because it carves us forever out of ever closer union. It means that the ratchet of the European Court taking power away from this country cannot happen in future.
The London mayor sparked the confrontation by backing a British exit from the European Union on Sunday, less than a day after Cameron had encouraged Britain to remain, while also announcing the date for a referendum on the issue on June 23rd. About half of the ruling Conservative Party, of which the mayor is a member, is reportedly ready to back a Brexit, in line with British public opinion. With the prospect of that currently too close to call, 4 months of intense debate and campaigning is expected. Fears of a Brexit also hit the British currency. The pound dropped to a 7-year low against the US dollar on Monday, marking a 3% drop since the beginning of the year and making the pound the worst performing major currency of 2016 so far. The ramifications of the vote are expected to be felt outside of Britain as well.
Let's not forget that absent a UK contribution to the EU budget, states like Germany, France, Italy will be contributing upwards of €1 billion or so each more to the EU budget every year. There'll be economic impact on other Eurozone countries, not just the UK.
Ratings agency Moody's also warned that Britain's strong credit score would be at risk if the public votes to leave the EU, saying that the potential economic cost of leaving would outweigh the benefits. Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
That's all the time we have for this hour's newscast. Thank you for watching.